Sri Lanka is also struggling with multiple crises. The entire cabinet has resigned. The embattled president has invited the opposition to join a unity government. All this as irate Sri Lankans came out onto the streets to protest against curfew orders and worsening economic conditions. Fresh reports suggest that President Gotabaya Rajapaksa has managed to form a temporary cabinet. This is its makeup for now. Until a permanent cabinet is formed, G.I. Peris will serve as the country's foreign minister. Ali Sabri has been sworn in as the new finance minister. Dinesh Gunawardena has been sworn in as Education Minister, and Johnston Fernando has been sworn in as the Minister of Highways. The new cabinet was formed after all 26 ministers in the government submitted letters of resignation last night. Everyone except the Rajapaksa brothers quit. After the ministers tendered their resignations, the move cleared the way for the president to appoint a new cabinet. Sri Lanka's central bank governor, Ajit Nivard Cabral, also resigned. Meanwhile, protests are currently underway in various parts of the island nation. They're taking place even as emergency law puts a strict prohibition in place against public assembly. For more, I'm joined now by Alan Keenan, a senior consultant on Sri Lanka for the International Crisis Group. He is right here in Washington, D.C. Mr. Keenan, thanks very much indeed for joining us here on WION. Let me start by asking you if the resignation of the cabinet in any way has eased the pressures that have been mounting against President Rajapaksa.
No, I don't think so. I think it's the first step in what will be a many-step process that really no one has a clue, where it will ultimately end. And of course, the big irony is that the protests, the chants of the protest and the hashtags online on social media have been Gota, go home, Gotabaya, go home. So everyone's gone home, but not Gotabaya. So I think, the protests are very much directed against the president first, the ruling family, the other Rajapaksa second, and the government third, and the political class fourth. Those are the targets. And so I don't think until I think we're just at the beginning of a very complicated kind of game of political chess that no one really can foresee the ultimate outcome.
And so this effort to reach out to the opposition and invite them to essentially join a unity government, too little, too late?
Well, I think here's what's happening. Gotabaya wants to cling to power. So he's trying to figure out some way to hold on despite the mass protests, which, as I said, are directed at him. But there are two constraints. So there's the problem with that is a lot of other people in the opposition don't want to join a cabinet under Gotabaya, partly because they know the popular sentiment is very much against Gotabaya and against the Rajapaksa family, but also because they will be taking on the responsibility of dealing with an economic and political crisis that is unparalleled in Sri Lanka's history. The economy is in complete nosedive, and even if it is rescued, as many people hope it will be, through the intervention of the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, who will then help to sort of negotiate with the international creditors some kind of reduced debt load. That will be done in exchange for very harsh restructuring policies. There will be, almost certainly large-scale austerity. There will be people will lose jobs in the government. The taxes will be raised. The budget deficit will be cut down. Whole range of things that will be very painful. And Sri Lanka's, having a lot of economic pain now. Average Sri Lankans are suffering a lot, but they're going to continue to suffer no matter what happens. And I think very few politicians are going to want to jump in and be responsible for that. So that's, I think, one of the key issues right now. On the other hand, no one also really wants to be president under this current situation. So if Gotabaya did resign, we'd still have the problem of who's going to take it up, who's going to take up that job. So I think, in some sense, it's a bit of musical chairs, and no one really wants to sit down and see who's in the hot seat in the end.
And how much risk are protesters taking as they take to the streets, even in the face of emergency laws that, on the face of it, ban public assembly?
Yeah, well, I think, the way I see the situation right now is there's a good news story and there's a bad news story. The bad news story is what we were just talking about, the current economic suffering that people are facing, truly, monumental proportions. And that's going to, as I said, even if it gets better, it's also going to get worse. So that's the bad news. The good news is that, first of all, that these protests are happening at all, that they began to happen, and that they named the problem very clearly, that it was Gotabaya and his administration's rule and incompetence, and that even in the face of initial police repression, we saw that last Thursday outside the house of Gotabaya, the protest that took place outside his house, and then the declaration of the state of emergency and the curfew, that despite all of that, people are asserting their democratic rights against a government which just a few months ago people were terrified of, many. Given the ruthless nature of the rule of the Rajapaksas when Mahinda, the brother of the current president, was president, and when Gotabaya was the head of the security forces then. So the fact that people are protesting in spite of that fear, which has, I think, slipped away now, and in spite of the long history of police repression of protests and state of emergency, curfew, that's all very positive. Now, it comes from people's anger at the suffering they're going through and the maladministration which led to this suffering. But it's still quite a positive story as well. And I think, the corollary of that is just a few months ago, certainly the last couple of years, many analysts, including diplomats and people, sort of officials of the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, have been very worried about the risk of large-scale human rights violations of the emergence of a truly authoritarian, repressive regime in Colombo, that is, we're not out of the woods yet. That's still a possibility, but I think the weakness of Gotabaya and the weakness of his family makes that much less of a risk now. So that's all positive.
Alan Keenan of the International Crisis Group, thanks very much indeed for shining a light on events in Sri Lanka for us here on WION. He is with the International Crisis Group right here in Washington, D.C.